Hi everyone! Today we're going to dive into some basic couture sewing techniques and I'm going to demonstrate them on this inner corset that I'm making to go inside a ball gown. Before you even start sewing, you have to trace the pattern and cut the fabric. In haute couture, you typically mark your sewing lines, notches, etc. with thread. This differs significantly from the industrial way where you don't mark sewing lines at all and you mark your notches or your darts either by clipping or drilling a hole. Because of how light colored this fabric is, I don't want to use chalk and risk staining it, so I pinned the pattern to my fabric, and now I'm tracing the sewing lines using a Tailors tack. It may have other names as well, but basically a Tailors tack is when you sew a stitch by hand. I usually make mine between 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 inch wide, but instead of a normal stitch, you leave a long tail at the end of the fabric. I tend to make mine about 1 inch long, and then when you come back up, you don't pull the stitch tight. You leave it loose so that it makes a loop. And then you do that again in the same spot. I usually do it about 2 to 3 times. And then you cut it off at the end, again, leaving about a 1 or more inch tail. Before we go any further, I just want to issue a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in haute couture techniques. My knowledge comes from 1 semester of couture sewing classes and this book by Claire Schaefer, which I think is indispensable if you want to learn couture sewing. I have never worked in an haute couture atelier, however, some people who see my videos have, so check out the comments and see if anybody has shared their knowledge there. Okay, so now I have the entire sewing line covered with these loopy Tailors tacks, as you can see. I marked the notches in green for a bit of contrast, and now I'm going to cut the middle of the loops. So now because I cut the middle of the loops, I'm pulling the pattern piece away so that the tacks are left on the fabric. Next, I use those Tailors tacks as guidelines to thread trace the seam lines. Some of my stitches are a bit wonky because I'm sitting pretty far away from the fabric in order for the camera to be between us and to pick up what I'm doing, so sorry about that. So now the entire piece is thread traced, including the seam lines and notches, and in a couture setting, you would do that for all your pattern pieces. Hopefully they would look a bit better than mine though. Mine is a little bit gathered and I accidentally made a run in the bottom. Oops. All right, we've cut the fabric, so now it's sewing time, and in particular, I'm going to talk about 3 common haute couture sewing techniques for seaming. Seaming means sewing 1 or more pieces of fabric to each other, as opposed to seam finishing, which is encasing the raw edge of generally 1 piece of fabric, sometimes 2, so that it doesn't unravel. I'm only going to be talking about seaming in this video. I'm going to save seam finishing for another video. I'm going to start with a whip stitch, and in this case I'm using it on a bra cup. I use quilting cotton for the inside of my bra cups to give them a nice shape while still maintaining some softness. And because quilting cotton is rather thick, I don't want to have a seam allowance, so I literally just butted the 2 raw edges up against each other and then whip stitched in between. Whip stitching, assuming I'm doing it right, is just poking the needle in on one side, poking it out through the other side to make a little horizontal line, and then doing that again. My little horizontal lines are about 1/8 of an inch, so 1/16 of an inch at either side of the raw edge, and they're about 1/16 of an inch away from each other. So that's it, it's pretty easy. And since I used a matching thread, you barely see it at all. On the side where I whip stitched, you see these little horizontal lines, and on the other side, you pretty much see nothing. It's kind of hidden in the cotton. Now, you wouldn't have to do a whip stitch with no seam allowance like I did. In fact, I don't know how common it is to do it the way I did. If you were going to do it with a seam allowance, I would say probably 1/8 of an inch seam allowance would be the best, 1/4 at absolute most. This is the kind of seam that looks best if it's not too far from the raw edge. That said, I'm not an expert at this, so if anybody has any thoughts, please leave a comment below so we can all learn more together. Now, I wouldn't have had to use a whip stitch for this. Another seam I could have used is a catch stitch. A catch stitch is basically just tiny X's. You start by sticking your needle through the fabric horizontally at the top with your needle pointing to the left, about 1/16 of an inch wide. Pull the thread through and then take your needle to the other piece of fabric slightly to the right of your first stitch, and you take just 1 or 2 threads, max 3 if your fabric is like really delicate, again with your needle pointing to the left. Pull the thread through and see it makes a little X. And then you do that again, a couple millimeters to the right of your previous X on the top row of the fabric, and then you bring it down to the right, catch a couple stitches, etc. This is a great stitch when you want to abut 2 pieces of fabric together, like with my bra cups, but you could also use it for hemming, attaching a label to something. The last stitch I'm going to show you is a slip stitch. This is a really handy stitch because if you do it right, it's pretty much invisible on the right side of a garment. I'll be demonstrating by slip stitching these boning channels to the main fabric of the corset. And yes, the boning channels are comically wide. I don't know what I was thinking. Please actually use your brain and measure stuff before you cut it out. Unlike me, it's really helpful. So I started my stitch inside the fold of the boning channel to hide the knot, and then I slipped it out through the fold a few millimeters down. I would say about 1/4 of an inch at most. And then I grabbed the smallest amount of threads possible on the main fabric. It really should only be about 1 thread if you want it to not be seen, although I didn't always achieve that level of perfection. And then you slip it back into the fold of the bias tape, kind of at an angle. And after you've sewn it, if you are very careful about only grabbing 1 thread from the main fabric, you will barely even see it. And that's all for today. Like I said earlier, I am going to make a video about couture seam finishes, so please subscribe if you don't want to miss that. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.